Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joy Bralick, and I am the Chief Administrative Officer at Family Source Consultants. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar, The Legal Process for Gestational Surrogates. I am joined today by Ryan Ferrante. He is a father, attorney, and advocate of assisted reproduction. So welcome, Ryan.
Thanks for having me, Joy. Good to see you again.
Always a pleasure. Our chats tend to go really long, so we'll see how well we can stay on topic because I know you and I like to discuss everything surrogacy and everything assisted reproduction. So let's get right in. We'll have you tell us a little bit about yourself and your professional background.
Yeah, you gave the headline. I am a assisted reproduction attorney, a collaborative reproduction attorney. It goes by many names. I used to be I tell people all the time, I used to be a boring old corporate tax attorney, and I transitioned into this career because of my own infertility experience with my wife. I'm very proud of the two children that I have, who were carried by a gestational surrogate in Florida. I'm always hopeful for the opportunity to talk about Stacy, but that's for another conversation. She was amazing. We'll leave it at that. In fact, when I represent surrogates and intended parents and donors and all sorts of collaborative reproduction arrangements. And frankly, when I represent surrogates, it's impossible for me to not think about Stacy, who was wonderful to our family and incredibly generous. But again, for another conversation, my practice is focused on counseling all the parties that are participating in egg donation or surrogacy or sperm donation or embryo donation. And so that's was a pivot from my previous career many years ago to solely focused on helping parties in these arrangements.
So it was a passion, a career change out of love.
Yeah, totally. It was, it was one of those things I watched, it did what lawyers or really anybody else would do when they are an intended parent in one of these arrangements. They throw themselves into it and they try and absorb as much information as possible. And here I thought that there was a real opportunity for somebody like me as a former intended parent to not just be a lawyer in these types of arrangements, but also someone who could, hold people's hands and say, these are some other things that you might want to think about. And so it's always been helpful to me. I'm not saying there's many great lawyers that are out there who didn't participate in a surrogacy arrangement themselves. But it is helpful just because I do call upon a lot of the things that I experience as an intended parent myself, or the ways that I would throw my body in front of a train for Stacy, and so those are it was a unique skill set that I thought I was bringing to the table when I started practicing this area.
Absolutely. Well, I know that we appreciate your expertise and we love having you on these webinars to kind of share that compassion, share your experiences, and really kind of guide us along the legal process. I know that, I was a two-time surrogate as well. Others might be just learning that, but I was incredibly grateful for my attorney and how diligently they walked me through the gestational surrogacy agreement. And I was fortunate enough to connect with my attorney through my agency, which at the time was Family Source Consultants. But why don't you tell us a little bit about how other surrogates might connect with their attorney? What's that first step?
Yeah, it's one of a few ways. A vast majority of the attorney-client relationships that happen in surrogacy arrangements are arranged through the agency. The agency has, especially the agencies that have been around for a long time, the reputable agencies, Family Source Consultants among them, they have established relationships over time with attorneys who specialize in this area, right? They know based on their own experiences with these attorneys that they know what they're doing. They know the process. They know how to establish legal parentage, and they know how to walk the parties through a really complicated legal landscape across state lines. And I'm sure we'll probably talk a little bit about that. But you wouldn't hire me to represent you in a criminal defense matter. Just not my area of expertise, right? And in the same way, you wouldn't hire, a medical malpractice litigator to represent you in your surrogacy arrangement, just because they don't have the experience with the nuances of surrogacy. So the agency is one sort of mechanism to finding your attorney. They have attorneys that they rely on for to refer their own clients to. I found that, based on previous experiences with surrogates or intended parents, I get calls all the time from somebody saying, you know, you represented A and B. They asked me to give you a call because they thought that you might be a good fit for representation for me. So that happens. I've also found that um, there are groups, support groups. There are whether online or in person, that where people who are experienced in surrogacy are having these conversations about who their lawyer was, or who their mental health professional was, or what agency they worked with. And so a lot of the professionals that are involved are getting sort of word of mouth referrals as well. But I would say that a vast majority of it is really in the space of the agency saying, these are the lawyers that we like to work with. You should give one of them or all of them a call and find the one that is the best fit for you.
Yeah, I think that's, I mean, you hit the nail on the head, of course. Like, whenever we're suggesting attorneys from the agency perspective, we really are focusing on those who are knowledgeable, who are going to be a good fit for the surrogate and their location and their needs and what they might have going on, whether it's international parents or domestic, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, there's a lot that we consider. I'm sure if any surrogate reaches out to a support group, they'll also get a long list of names that they can go through. So, let's take that one step further. If I am a potential surrogate looking for my attorney and my agency has given me three, or I go online and I hit 50, um, what do I need to consider? What's like the number one thing that I should help to like kind of narrow down what attorney I should be working with?
This is an excellent question, and it's uh, somebody asks me this all the time, but they're asking me in a different way. They're saying, what should we be looking for in a surrogate? If you're an intended parent, what should we be looking for in a surrogate? What should we be looking for in the agency that we want to work with? Because they're not all the same, right? Not all agencies are the same. Not all attorneys are exactly alike. Not all surrogates are the same. Everyone has different ideas about the way these arrangements should happen. So on an attorney level, and when if I'm looking for an attorney, I'm first thing I'm thinking about is experience. Does this person have that experience in this area to be able to represent me in the best way possible? And it also comes down to comfort on a personal level. You're going to be spending a lot of time with your lawyer, okay? Whoever, whatever the audience looks like here, it's I think it's all surrogates, but whether surrogates or intended parents, you're going to be spending a lot of time with this person. I tell people all the time, if you're sick of my voice already, I'm probably not a good fit, because you're going to be hearing a lot of it. And so another thing, attorneys may not share this directly, but you can sort of glean what their philosophy is. And you may not know what you're looking for when I say that, but um, an attorney's philosophy in representation in a surrogacy arrangement may differ. And so if you talk to two different lawyers, maybe you say, gosh, I think they are going to approach this differently. Um, for me, it's about understanding what a surrogate's hopes and desires and intentions are for the arrangement, so that you know I can create a lens that I'm going to look through when I'm reviewing a contract or making recommendations to a surrogate. Um, but more important than that, and you really may hear this when you talk to a lawyer, is an understanding of what that attorney thinks their role is. Okay, what is the attorney's role? Um, I view my role as there's a couple of things that you have to think about. For me, this is what I'm thinking about. How do I act as the most zealous possible advocate for a surrogate? Okay, how do I represent her interests in the best possible way that I can? but I also don't want to do anything to damage the relationship between the parties. Okay. Sometimes this gets lost on in the legal process where the legal process may cross a threshold where it feels like it's damaging the relationship a little bit. That's not what we're here for. That's not what lawyers should be doing. We should be representing our party's interests, but also be very mindful of the relationship between the parties that's going to go on for a very long time. And so, those are the things that I'm thinking about. And if you are a surrogate and you're listening to attorneys talk about what they think should happen or how they're going to approach this, make sure that you're comfortable with that. Because when the legal process does start, replacing an attorney is also a really cumbersome task and not something that you want to do. You can, of course, if you want to, but you want to avoid any further delays. I also, I say that reminds me, I tell people all the time that as a former intended parent, by the time they get to me, by the time they're having a conversation with me about how do we, you know, um, how do we proceed here? Which lawyer do we choose? I tell them I'm very mindful of many things, but more important than anything else, by the time you get to me, you've run out of patience. Your patience is gone. Okay, and I get that. And so there's just a number of things that intended parents or surrogates um, are looking for when they're having those conversations, and it all points back to somebody that you're most comfortable with.
I love that you touched on your kind of your experience as an intended parent and how you kind of guide them. I will say, as my experience as a surrogate and how I guide our clients within Family Source, I just make sure that you understand that your attorney is going to be your guide. Their job is to make sure that you understand, that you feel comfortable, and that you are getting the best outcome for the journey as a whole. They will look out for your best interests, but then you have to understand that the other side, that attorney is looking out for the intended parent's best interests. And really, I just encourage everyone to kind of keep that in mind, fight for what you believe is right in your heart, and then move forward with the guidance of the attorney on what is should be right on paper.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
love it, love it. All right, so we have narrowed down our searches. We are now choosing to move forward with our attorney. What can a surrogate expect in that first meeting?
Okay. First meeting. Well, first meeting is after you've selected an attorney. Um, I suppose everybody does it a little bit differently. I mean, I guess I've sat in on other lawyers doing this type of thing, but I've taken maybe taken a little different approach. If there's any lawyers that are listening, they may say that's not how I do that, and that's okay, right?
Okay.
Um,
Very
for me, I want to set expectations. The very first conversation is about the legal process, right? At a high level, what are we trying to accomplish here? What's the end goal? My representation of you, where does it begin? Where does it end? And what are we going to do in the middle? Okay. And so, um, first of all, again, being very mindful with people who, maybe have never had a lawyer before, right? Maybe they've never had a need for a lawyer. That's probably a good thing. But when they're having those conversations, when you have that initial conversation, you have to remind them we're on the same team. Okay. Me and you are on the same team. All of our conversations are protected by the attorney client privilege. I don't work for an agency. I don't work for the intended parents. I work for you. Okay. And so what you say to me stays between us, unless, of course, you give me permission to share it with somebody else. But it's very important that we have, a level of trust that must be established at the very beginning. So we're setting expectations about the content of those conversations and an invitation to share as much as you want to share during those conversations, because I am only your lawyer. Okay. Um, Beyond the process, and when I say process, I'm talking um, what we're going to try to accomplish today is you're going to help me understand what your hopes and desires and intentions are for this surrogacy arrangement. You're going to help me create that lens that I'm going to look through when I'm drafting the agreement or making recommendations to you. Then we're going to review the draft agreement together. Okay, that's in a follow-up conversation. We're going to review the draft agreement together because 99.9% of the time, little preview of what we might talk about in a second, the intended parent's lawyer always drafts the agreement 99.9% of the time. And so they get the first crack at it. They send us what they hope will be for the arrangement, what their hopes will be for the arrangement, and we modify that agreement. By the way, I tell surrogates this all the time. Making changes to a contract is expected. They expect you on the other side to make changes to the contract. Do not think that making changes is in any way going to jeopardize the arrangement. Their lawyer has told them, you're going to see changes. Okay. When it comes back, it's going to happen. Okay. And so we sort of set the calendar. That second meeting, we're going to review the draft. Then I'm going to send you some red lines with my recommendations as to what we should do to the contract. Then we're going to send it back to the intended parent's lawyer. When that happens, that's when things start happening very quickly. We're going to swap this thing back and forth, get to a final agreement. You're going to sign it. Legal clearance is going to go to the clinic. You're going to be on your way. I'm not going anywhere. I'm still going to be available to you throughout the process to answer any questions that you might have. But that's when a lot of the work is done at the very beginning. And setting that foundation and setting the expectations for the arrangement is critically important to having a successful or productive attorney-client relationship. Okay. So then beyond process, if the surrogate has any questions, I'm going to answer them during that first meeting. We're going to, like I said, we're going to set that calendar for the process going forward. It's really in that second meeting when we're really starting to peel back the layers of the arrangement and discuss background. I want to get to know you. I want to know what motivates you, and details about, we're going to talk about details of the medical professionals involved. Did you meet Dr. Smith yet? Did you have a mental health assessment? How did that go? Tell me more about that. What their lives are like, and what do I need to know about your travel habits or routines, so that when we talk about travel restrictions in a contract, I am doing what I can to, sort of carve out your routines. And then we get into some pretty sensitive topics too. As you can imagine, we talk about a potential termination of pregnancy, or really, I ask this question all the time. I want you to put yourself back into the conversation that you've had with the intended parents already, because anything that you've discussed has already set an expectation. And so if they've heard you say something already, then I'm sure we're going to see it in the agreement. And so we don't want to do anything that is going to be inconsistent with any mutual understanding between the parties up to that point. And then, there's other details. We're going to confirm the insurance needs of the surrogate. What does the delivery room look like? What does, your routine appointments look like? What are your hopes for that? And so, remember I said earlier that, if you don't like my voice, you might not want me to represent you. This is why. I mean, we're going to have lengthy conversations about hopes and desires and intentions for the arrangement. Sorry for the long-winded answer.
It's all right. I'll just let you talk, because if you give me the moment to talk, I'm going to do the exact same.
Sure.
I love that you touched on some of those kind of minor details, or I shouldn't call them minor details because they're very important, but details that can be tweaked. There are parts of the contract that can be adjusted, it can be changed. Those are expected. But more importantly, and it kind of segues nicely into my next question, you talked about those fundamental conversations that the surrogates have with the parents prior to coming to legal. So let's touch a little bit on that. What can a surrogate kind of look for or discuss within the matching process prior to being matched with an intended parent, prior to moving forward, prior to really diving into this process and getting to legal? What are some major aspects of the contract that we should be thinking about before we even move forward?
Love that. Okay. I've been in that meeting. I've been in a virtual meeting being introduced to somebody who was a stranger. Okay. And who my wife and I were, hoping would be the perfect fit for us. Right. It goes both ways. It's not just about intended parents choosing surrogates. Surrogates choose intended parents. Right.
Exactly. Yep. It's nerve-wracking for everyone.
Yes, yes. And so, yeah, and, I always tell people, the other side's probably way more nervous than you. Is that true? Probably, right? 50% of the time, it's got to be true. Anyway, what should surrogates be looking for? Um, you know, it's rare that I get the opportunity to have that part of the conversation before it happens, right? I don't usually talk to a surrogate before she's had that virtual meeting with their prospective intended parents. However, if I did have that conversation, I would tell them to focus on one very important thing. Listen to what's important to them. If they talk about things over and over again, that's important to them. And can it be something that you are like-minded on, right? If the intended parents came to the table in this virtual meeting and said something like, we want very broad discretion to request a termination of pregnancy for any number of reasons. Is that something that you're comfortable with? Because if it's not a good match, right? If the intended parent said, we want to be as involved as we can possibly be, we don't live very far from you, we're going to attend every appointment, we're going to be in that delivery room, we want to talk to the doctor whenever, which they should have the right to do anyway. But is that the type of arrangement that you want, where there is consistent involvement at every step of the arrangement? Now, for me, Lindsay and I lived 1,000 miles away from our surrogate. We weren't gonna be in every appointment. Virtually, we could be, but physically, it wasn't possible. Um, and so, listen to the intended parents about what is important to them. They're going to talk about whether it's potential termination or involvement, or you know, some intended parents have very bizarre requests. About diet or exercise, or um, I shouldn't say bizarre. They're just sometimes extraordinary. And if they don't mention that as something that's important to them, maybe it's important to you. And maybe you want to tell them that, you want to be able to continue your routine exercise that, you agree will be subject to the physician's instructions. And so during those match meetings, I've always just thought about um, leaving that meeting and not being so far apart on something that you're never going to meet in the middle on it. And I'm not saying that there may be nothing that you're even there's no air between your positions with the intended parents, and that's great. But if there is any, how important is it to you? How important is it to you that you know if the intended parent, if there's only one person allowed in the delivery room, it's got to be one of the intended parents. Is that important to you that it's not the right fit for you? And so I just always hate to go into specifics because those conversations really can go in a million different directions.
Oh,
And if you get it, you just want to listen to what's important to them. And you're always
I-
going to have somebody like Joy on the call too, who's going to be driving the conversation anyway, and asking the questions of the parties that the other want answers to. So that's always really very helpful.
yes. I think that's my biggest forte in match meetings is I
Yeah.
will not allow vagueness in questions because I feel like there
Ooh.
are certain things that we have to
Yeah.
worry about. And I want to kind of like elaborate on what you had said. Anything that you feel so passionately about that you are not willing to compromise even in the slightest, I think that needs to be discussed prior.
Sure.
Um, Termination is always a big one. COVID vaccination. If an attended parents clinic requires the COVID vaccine and you are strongly against it, we
Yeah.
ran into that a lot in these past
Yeah.
few years.
Yeah.
That would be a fundamentally non-change. We can't negotiate that. So
Yeah.
that's something you want to kind of get out in the open in the beginning.
Yeah.
Communication is a big one, making sure you're on the same page. So I love that you
Yeah.
touched on all that. Now,
You just reminded me of one other thing though, and this is important to
yeah,
bring up. Um, I mentioned earlier that I only represent the surrogate, or I represent the intended parents. You got to remember, the other side's got independent legal representation, right? And so they're going to be given advice and recommendations themselves. Now, in every contract, and I'm not going to get into the reasons why because it's a lengthy conversation or explanation, there's always a travel restriction, meaning the surrogate can't travel after a certain period beyond a certain mile perimeter or must stay within the state. Now, many surrogates live in border towns, right? and maybe they do their shopping across state lines. Okay. How important is that to you? Because if the intended parents aren't willing to budge on that perimeter, meaning they say, we don't want you to leave the state of Illinois and go shopping in the state of Indiana after week 30 or 32, is that going to be a non-negotiable point for you, right? And so you have to think about the very specific circumstances of each party and how it affects the hopes and desires and intentions of the other party, and how far apart are we on those before we get to the contract stage, which I'm sure is something that you want to talk about.
No, I think that's really important. Within the agency, if we ever have a surrogate who is on a border town, that is something that we will bring up
Yeah,
purposefully
right.
because we understand how important that is, that she be near the hospital for delivery, insurances. There's several factors that go into why they need to stay in the state that they're intending to deliver in. But let's shift a little bit and kind of go into the contracts themselves.
Mm,
So when we are looking at the contracts, you already kind of touched on how they begin, that the intended parents, the majority of the time, the intended parents attorney will draft the agreement and send that to the surrogate's attorney for review. And then that's where you kind of jump in for the surrogate support and going through with your advice, red lines, etc.
hmm
Let's talk about a little bit on what type of things are the surrogates able, willing to change, negotiate. I mean, we touched on a little bit, but I think that's a big one for surrogates, about feeling comfortable and confident in what they have control over.
Okay. This goes back to what I said earlier about expectations, right? The surrogate profile has been provided regardless of agency. The intended parents have an idea of what the financials are going to be. Okay. Whether they're, non-negotiable, negotiable, they have a pretty good idea that, the surrogate is going to be paid, say, just for example, you know, if there's, what example do I want to use? Let's just use base compensation. If it's X, they're not expecting the surrogate to come back and say, I'm only going to do it for Y. Okay. Because we have
Exactly.
set expectations already before we get into this contract phase. Okay. I have a list of questions that I ask, that regardless of the arrangement, I want to know the answer because it helps me create that lens that I'm going to look through when I'm reviewing the agreement. So, based on the answers that a surrogate and her spouse, if she has one, that they give to me about what they hope for the arrangement, um, travel restriction is a perfect example. We just talked about it. That is usually something you're going to see a red line on, because there may not, because the intended parents and their lawyer don't have a full picture of the daily routines or seasonal routines or habits of a surrogate. That's my job. My job is to understand that and create contract language that allows her to continue those routines and habits within reason, right? It's never reasonable for a surrogate to be able to leave the state where she intends to deliver at week 39. It's just not reasonable, right?
Yeah.
And so it's my job to help her explain to me what is important to her, okay, and to her family. And so travel restriction is usually an area that we may revise, we may modify that section. When I say the financial terms are sort of set, we set an expectation there, there's always little tweaks that might happen. We're not trying to change the amount, but maybe we tweak something in the way the contract is written. These are style changes that lawyers love to make. Um, Maybe there's something inconsistent in the financial terms. That's also the job of the lawyer, is to make sure that the financial terms are consistent with the expectations of the party, right? So an example here would be, on lost wages. Surrogates are reimbursed for lost wages should she be on bed rest or for recovery from delivery. And what may be inconsistent is the expectation of what that reimbursement is going to look like. For example, you may have a surrogate who makes $25 per hour at her job. She should be reimbursed if she still has that job at $25 per hour for any actual lost wages incurred as a result of participating in the arrangement. But what if she tells me, I'm confident I'm going to be getting a promotion soon. And when I get that promotion, even if it's a month from now, right around the time of an embryo transfer, I might be making $50 per hour. Well, we're going to have to think about creative ways to make sure that the intended parents know that the lost wages could be significantly higher. Can we do that? Depends, which is a very lawyerly answer that you're going to hear from multiple judges. It depends on whether or not there's been something agreed to, or has the expectation been set? Have the intended parents expressed that lost wages is a real concern for them and it's important to them that this be stuck at this rate? I got questions.
And
Okay.
that's when both sides of the attorneys would step in, and that's when the contract goes back and forth with summer red lines, review on both sides, and that you have the opportunity then to kind of iron that out.
You got it.
Perfect. I love that you said the word reasonable. I think that is my favorite word whenever I'm discussing contracts with surrogates. They're like, what can I ask for? What can I put in there? Anything that is reasonable.
Mm-hmm.
And typically I follow that up with pertaining to the surrogacy. We don't want to request anything that's not pertaining to the surrogacy, because that's not what this is about. We are trying to be reasonable for all parties. And I love that word. It's one of my favorites. I throw it out all the time. But that having your profile set up, and I think it's really important that surrogates and intended parents alike know when you're filling out that initial profile, it's not something to take lightly, because that is the kind of the foundation, the expectations, like you said, of what everyone is moving into this journey based on. If that is something that you kind of filled out on a whim, and then you get into legal contracts and you're like, wait, I feel very strongly about this, even though I didn't present it in the profile. Well, that's where we tend to run into the issues. That's where we tend to have a lot of hiccups, and then the contracts take even longer. So being very clear in that initial conversations, that initial match meeting, your initial profile, set up those expectations. And that's kind of my advice for all the surrogates that are listening now. So please set up those expectations, be truthful to yourself on what you need and what you're requiring of the journey. And then the intended parents will do the same, and everyone can agree before they move forward.
Great advice.
All right. Well, let's talk a little bit about, I know in the very beginning, we kind of touched on location. So let's talk a little bit about states. Does it matter what state your attorney is in based on where you live?
It depends.
I knew that attorney answer was coming.
Yes. Okay. So here's the deal. When we talk about the law and the way that it governs surrogacy arrangements, you really have to think about it this way. There's no federal law. It's state law that's going to govern the contract. And by the way, I tell people all the time, I use a silly metaphor for this, or a silly way to sort of deliver this message. But I always think about surrogacy in the law in two buckets. First bucket is the contract. That's going to be governed by state law. We'll come back to that. The second bucket is parentage. That's also going to be governed by state law. What law is going, I don't want to turn this into a law school class, trust me, but I'm going to start to sound like I am. What law is going to govern the contract? It depends. It could be really the law where the surrogate lives. Could be the law where the intended parents live. Could be the law where the embryo transfer is going to occur. Those could be three different states, right? So the lawyers will put their heads together and say, it's probably a good idea if we use Illinois law to control the contract. They've got a statute there. We can rely on the requirements in the law. It's a good idea, okay? Because the intended parents live there, for example. You just have to have, and this is going to sound like law school, you have to have a sufficient nexus to the arrangement in order to be able to apply a certain state's law, okay? So if you had intended parents who lived in Illinois and their clinic was in Colorado and their surrogate lived in Florida, that was my arrangement, by the way, we wouldn't use California law to control the contract because there's no California connection. We could use Florida law. We'll probably end up using Florida law or Illinois law, okay? But you might consider, some attorney might make an argument that Colorado law could apply, okay? So it's really dependent upon recommendations from the attorney about the best approach to the law that governs the contract, okay? So, and I'm going to get back to which attorney should be representing the parties in that arrangement in a second, but I just want to talk about parentage. the law that governs the parentage process is always going to be the law of where the surrogate lives or where she delivers, right? Because that's the jurisdiction that's going to issue the birth certificate. Okay.
Okay.
And so that is the state that's going to recognize the birth. Now, one state on parentage, and any of a number of states on the contract. Okay. Now, when you talk about the contract, the person who's drafting the contract, so let's say in the example I gave you where you have intended parents who live in Illinois, you have a clinic in Colorado and a surrogate in Florida, which law should govern the contract and who's the attorney that should represent the intended parents? Because remember, 99.9% of the time, that intended parent's lawyer is going to draft the contract. Nobody should be drafting a contract unless they're licensed in the state that's going to govern the contract. So if you use Illinois law, you want an Illinois lawyer drafting that contract. There's some exceptions to that, but I'm not going to get into it. But that's the general rule, okay? The attorney who represents the surrogate in Florida could be an Illinois lawyer, could be a Florida lawyer, because that contract is also going to reference the fact that Florida law is going to control the parentage. And so maybe you want a Florida lawyer to sort of modify that agreement to set expectations for the parties on the parentage piece, okay? So the point is that the law that's going to govern the contract, you should have a lawyer who is licensed in that state if you're the intended parents. If you're the surrogate, you could have, I've seen a representation by a lawyer from that same state or a lawyer who is licensed in the state where you live. So it's just based on recommendations by the agency and, comfort level with the attorneys and decisions by the attorneys about the controlling law.
Perfect. Yeah. As an agency, that's something we take into consideration. I've listened
You
to
sure do.
your
You
attorney
sure
speak
do.
many times. I know all of the nexus
Yeah.
phrases, and we're very well versed in exactly what the best setup would be for everyone. And if they're not in that initial contact, one of the questions we ask is, are you comfortable drafting this agreement? And the attorneys will be honest with us in return and let us know, no, I'm not licensed there. My recommendation would be XYZ instead. And so we take that into consideration before we actually recommend any attorneys to surrogates or parents. And in today's world, you don't have to have an attorney that's in your state. Most of your business, correct me if I'm wrong, is done virtually. There's not necessarily a need to meet in person.
I would love to meet all of my clients. I would love to meet them before, during, and after the arrangements. I would love to meet them in person. It's frankly just not necessary, right? Most of my consultations are just like this, where we're just having a conversation. I'm another example. I'm licensed in the state of Missouri and Illinois. I'm not going to go to Missouri if I don't have to, because I live in Chicago. And that happens with a lot of attorneys are licensed in multiple states. And so you may have representation in a completely Illinois arrangement. You have intended parents who live in Illinois. You have the embryo transfer is going to occur in Illinois. The surrogate lives in Illinois. She's going to deliver in Illinois. And then all of a sudden you got this lawyer who lives in Denver. How is that? Well, they're licensed to practice law in the state of Illinois. They don't need to be physically present in order to provide that legal advice. So that can happen as well.
Yep, you described my journeys to a T. That's exactly what happened. Everything was in Illinois, except my attorney was not. But they were licensed in Illinois, and they were wonderful, and everything was done virtually. So.
Great.
Perfect. You touched on parentage, so unless there's anything else you really wanted to dive into there, I would love to hear your thoughts on that, or I can kind of wrap up with my last question.
Yeah, parentage it's a complicated process that can be made very simple. You just need to have proper representation in the state where you are going to deliver. Every state is a little bit different, right? So just because your friend who was a surrogate delivered in Illinois and they went through this really simple certification process where they just signed a piece of paper and then they got filed with the Illinois Department of Public Health, that is not the case in almost every other state, if not every other state. You're going to have to sign petitions for parentage and, powers of attorney designating authority to the intended parents to make decisions for the child immediately upon birth if legal parentage has not yet been established. There's a number of different processes and procedures depending on the state where you deliver, and so parentage is frankly does not look exactly the same in two states.
No, that's a great addition. I love that because I think that is an expectation from surrogates that they wouldn't be involved in the parentage at all. It's not their child. It's
Right?
I shouldn't have to do anything. Now,
Do they have to make an appearance in court? Almost certainly not. But it happens. And your lawyer is going to give you an idea as to what to expect when it comes to the parentage piece.
exactly. And should a surrogate ever need their own legal representation for parentage, that's something that an agency would help you discover
For
and
sure.
set up and get in contact with. So
For sure.
um, it's never something that a surrogate has to feel like they're alone. They're going to be guided through the entire process of legal, all the way from contracts to parentage. So I
Hmm.
love that we have our collaborative efforts and our partnerships with attorneys all across the United States that we can kind of connect with and offer up for our surrogates. So now, understanding you can't provide legal advice broadly, do
Hmm.
you have any words of wisdom for your
Mm.
um, experience as a parent, as experience as an attorney, speaking directly to our surrogates, because that's what this is about, the legal process for surrogates? What words of wisdom might you have for a new surrogate?
Um, I tell intended parents the same thing that I tell surrogates. Because when when my relationship starts with a client, whether it be intended parent or surrogate, the intended parents and the surrogate don't really know each other, right? They've met each other one time, and they're going to be involved in this really, really intimate experience together. Um, Not all of the relationships between intended parents and surrogates are the same. Okay. In that match meeting, I mentioned listen to what's important to them that can be helpful in your relationship with whoever the other party is. Um, you're strangers. Your relationship with your intended parents is going to evolve over time. Our surrogate, Stacy, stranger to us. Did we think we were going to have somebody that would end up being part of our family? No, of course not. Right? That happened naturally. Our relationship evolved in a way that we didn't expect, um, and maybe it doesn't end that way. Maybe it um, maybe it's you guys share this intimate experience, and then you go on with your lives, right? Um, I still have a I text Stacy all the time, right? I wish I did more, right? But I still have a relationship with her. My wife and Stacy are very close. You can't anticipate what that's going to look like. You're strangers, and if you listen to what's important to each other during the arrangement, it's much more likely that you're going to have a successful relationship when this is all over.
Well, right.
That's my
Is
advice.
that is amazing advice, and I'm very happy that you shared that with us. Basically, you just be open to the
Yeah,
process, be open
that's right.
to each other's concerns. I love every bit of that. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Ryan. Thank you, everyone who
Always.
joined in to listen. It's always a pleasure to learn from you and listen to you and kind of have a nice collaborative
Always.
conversation.
Yeah.
So if anyone listening has any more questions about the legal process or about surrogacy in general, you're more than welcome to reach out to Ryan Ferrante directly, or you can reach out to Family Source Consultants. We are more than happy to share all of our wealth of knowledge and really assist you in whatever way possible to get you a positive, productive journey.
I love
Thank
having
you.
these conversations. Is that
Oh, yes.
clear?
Yes.
Yeah.
uh, always a pleasure. And I know that you and I will have many, many more conversations to come. So thank
Can't
you,
wait to do it
everyone.
again.
And
Thanks, Joy.
thank you. Enjoy the rest of your day.